Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, a landmark in the fight for freedom. Introduction. The turning point in American history. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by President Abraham Lincoln on January 1, 1863, was a revolutionary document in the history of the United States. It marked a pivotal moment in the fight to abolish slavery in the country and fundamentally changed the course of the Civil War. While it did not immediately free all enslaved people, the proclamation shifted the war's focus from merely preserving the Union to actively fighting for the freedom of the enslaved. The Emancipation Proclamation is seen as one of the most important steps toward the eventual end of slavery in the United States, culminating in the passage of the 13th Amendment 3 years later. 1. The context: slavery and the Civil War. The institution of slavery in the U.S. By the early 1860s, slavery had been deeply entrenched in the American South, where it was central to the economy, particularly in the agricultural sectors like cotton, tobacco, and sugar. Enslaved people in the South were denied basic human rights and were forced into labor under brutal conditions, while their enslavers reaped the economic benefits of their exploitation. The institution of slavery had long been a source of tension between the northern and southern states. While many northern states had abolished slavery by the early 19th century, the South had defended and expanded it, particularly after the invention of the cotton gin in the late 18th century, which increased the demand for slave labor. The outbreak of the Civil War. The American Civil War began in 1861 after several southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. The main issue dividing the North and the South was slavery, with the northern states generally advocating for the abolition of slavery, and the southern states seeking to preserve it as part of their economic and social structure. And as the war progressed, Abraham Lincoln initially focused on preserving the Union rather than directly attacking slavery. But over time, he realized that the abolition of slavery was crucial not only to the war effort but also to securing a more just and lasting peace. 2. The road to the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln's evolving views on slavery. Abraham Lincoln was initially cautious about interfering with slavery in the South, particularly in border states like Kentucky and Maryland, where slavery was legal but the states remained in the Union. Lincoln's priority was always to maintain the Union, even if that meant leaving slavery intact in southern states for the time being. However, as the war dragged on, Lincoln began to see the abolition of slavery as a strategic necessity. He realized that freeing the enslaved would not only weaken the South's economy but also strengthen the moral cause of the Union. The military strategy. In 1862, Lincoln began to shift his approach to slavery, realizing that it was not just a moral issue but a military one as well. As Union armies advanced into the southern territories, many enslaved people fled to Union lines. Their labor was often used to support the Union war effort. Lincoln recognized that by freeing the enslaved, he could diminish the Southern economy and disrupt the Confederacy's war-making capacity. Additionally, Lincoln saw the abolition of slavery as a way to gain international support, particularly from European nations, many of which had already abolished slavery and would have been hesitant to support a pro-slavery government. 3. The Emancipation Proclamation. The issuance of the proclamation. After months of deliberation and political maneuvering, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862, following the Union victory at the Battle of Antietam. The proclamation declared that as of January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in the Confederate States were to be freed. The Emancipation Proclamation applied to states that had seceded from the Union and were still in rebellion. It did not apply to the border states or parts of the South that were already under Union control. These exceptions were made to maintain the loyalty of the border states to the Union cause. While the Emancipation Proclamation did not immediately free all enslaved people, it signaled a new national policy, setting the stage for the eventual abolition of slavery across the country. The proclamation's key points. The Emancipation Proclamation had several key components. It freed all enslaved people in the Confederate States that were still in rebellion as of January 1, 1863. It authorized the recruitment of African American soldiers into the Union Army and Navy, recognizing the potential of formerly enslaved people to contribute to the Union cause. It applied only to areas under Confederate control, Enslaved people in Union-controlled territories were not immediately freed. However, it laid the groundwork for the eventual legal end to slavery. 4. The immediate impact of the Emancipation Proclamation. The reaction in the South. In the Confederacy, the Emancipation Proclamation had little immediate effect, as the Confederate States were not under Union control. However, it had a profound psychological impact on both the enslaved and their enslavers. Many enslaved people saw the proclamation as a symbol of hope and began fleeing to Union lines, where they were often welcomed and put to work for the Union war effort. The Confederacy rejected the Emancipation Proclamation and saw it as a direct threat to their way of life. The impact on the Union Army. The proclamation allowed for the recruitment of African American soldiers into the Union Army. By the end of the Civil War, over 180,000 African Americans had served in the Union Army, contributing significantly to the Union victory. The inclusion of African American soldiers also helped to solidify the moral imperative of the Union cause, as it was now clear that the fight was not just about preserving the Union but about securing freedom for the enslaved. 5. Long-term consequences and legacy. The path to the 13th Amendment. While the Emancipation Proclamation was a significant step toward freedom, it was a wartime measure and only applied to the Confederate States in rebellion. Slavery was still legal in the border states, and it was clear that permanent abolition required a constitutional amendment. In 1865, 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, which abolished slavery throughout the United States, forever ending the legal institution of slavery. The proclamation's enduring significance. The Emancipation Proclamation is seen as one of Lincoln's greatest achievements, both for its moral clarity and for its strategic genius in weakening the Confederacy. The proclamation also set the stage for the broader civil rights movements that would continue for over a century, culminating in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Emancipation Proclamation remains a symbol of the United States' commitment to the principles of freedom, equality, and justice. It is an enduring reminder of the power of government action to right historical wrongs. A landmark in the struggle for freedom. The Emancipation Proclamation was not just a legal document but a defining moment in the United States' journey toward freedom and equality. While it did not immediately free all enslaved people, it was a bold declaration that changed the trajectory of the Civil War and laid the groundwork for the eventual abolition of slavery. It altered the course of history, both within the United States and around the world, sending a clear message that the era of slavery in America was coming to an end. The legacy of the Emancipation Proclamation continues to resonate today as a symbol of the ongoing fight for freedom and human rights. Industrial Revolution labor movements. 19th century, the fight for workers' rights. Introduction. The rise of the working class. The Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries brought about transformative changes to society, reshaping economies, industries, and social structures across the globe. While technological advancements and innovations led to unprecedented economic growth, they also created harsh living and working conditions for the growing working class. In the face of these challenges, the labor movements of the 19th century emerged as a powerful force advocating for workers' rights, better working conditions, and social justice. These movements not only shaped the future of labor relations, but also laid the foundation for workers' rights reforms that would evolve throughout the 20th century. 1. The Industrial Revolution. A new economic order. The shift from agrarian to industrial societies. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century in Great Britain, marked the transition from agrarian economies to industrialized ones. Our advancements in technology and manufacturing, including the steam engine, spinning jenny, and power loom, allowed for the mass production of goods and the rapid expansion of factories. This led to the growth of urban centers as people from rural areas moved to cities in search of work. However, the rapid urbanization resulted in overcrowded living conditions, poor sanitation, and a lack of adequate public services. The growth of factories and the emergence of the working class. Factories became the central hub of industrial production, and the demand for labor increased dramatically. Large numbers of working-class individuals, including women and children, were employed in factories, mines, and mills under grueling conditions. These workers often faced long working hours, 12 to 16 hours a day, low wages, unsafe working environments, and poor living conditions. The exploitation of workers, especially in dangerous industries like mining and textiles, became a major issue during this period. 2. The early labor movements. Organizing for change. The rise of workers' organizations. As the working class grew, so did the desire to improve living and working conditions. In response to poor treatment and low wages, workers began organizing into unions and collective movements. Early labor movements were often unregulated and faced harsh opposition from factory owners, who sought to maintain control over wages and working conditions. The idea of collective bargaining, where workers could negotiate with employers as a group, began to take root as workers realized their individual voices were often ignored. Early strikes and protests. As part of these growing movements, strikes and protests became more common. Workers walked out of factories demanding better wages, safer working conditions, and fewer working hours. One of the earliest and most significant strikes occurred in 1811, when workers in the English textile industry organized the Luddite protests. The Luddites, named after a mythical leader Ned Ludd, famously destroyed factory machinery in protest of labor-saving technology that they believed would reduce their job opportunities. Although the Luddite movement was ultimately crushed by authorities, it highlighted the growing tensions between industrial progress and the rights of workers. 3. The evolution of labor rights. Key events and legal reforms. The formation of trade unions. The 1830s and 1840s saw the formalization of trade unions, as workers sought to have a stronger, more organized voice in negotiating wages and working conditions. The Factory Acts, starting in 1833, were some of the first pieces of legislation aimed at regulating labor conditions, particularly for women and children. These laws began to set limits on the number of hours worked by miners and required regular inspections of factories. The Chartist movement, 1838 to 1850, also emerged in Britain, calling for universal male suffrage, secret ballots, and other democratic reforms to give the working class more political power. Although Chartism failed to achieve immediate political change, it laid the groundwork for future labor reforms. The 8-hour workday movement. One of the most significant labor reforms sought by industrial workers was the reduction of working hours. In the early 19th century, workers often faced 12 to 16-hour workdays, with little time for rest, family life, or education. The 8-hour workday movement gained traction in the mid-19th century, with workers in various industries pushing for a more humane work schedule. In 1866, the National Labor Union in the U.S. formally called for an 8-hour workday. Though it took decades to achieve, this demand was finally met in 1938 with the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which established the 40-hour workweek in the United States. 4. Labor movements and the growth of socialism and Marxism. The influence of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. The Communist Manifesto, 1848, written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, had a profound impact on the labor movements of the 19th century. Marx and Engels argued that the working class, or proletariat, was being exploited by the capitalist class, or bourgeoisie. And according to Marxist theory, the only way to end this exploitation was through a revolution that would overthrow the capitalist system and establish a socialist society in which the means of production were collectively owned by the people. Socialism became a key ideological force within labor movements, especially in Europe. Workers' rights organizations began to demand not only better working conditions but also political power and a redistribution of wealth. The rise of socialist and communist political parties. By the late 19th century, labor movements began to align with socialist political parties that sought broader societal reforms. In countries like Germany, France, and Britain, socialist parties formed to represent the working class in parliament and to push for labor laws and welfare reforms. In Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, influenced by Marxist ideas, would lead to the establishment of the Soviet Union, a major turning point in labor history, as the government sought to build a society based on Marxist principles. 5. Global impact of 19th century labor movements. Labor rights reforms in the U.S. The labor movements in the United States mirrored many of the developments seen in Europe. Workers in the US fought for better wages, working conditions, and shorter hours. In the late 19th century, labor unions like the American Federation of Labor, AFL, pushed for legislative reforms. The Haymarket Riot of 1886 in Chicago, which began as a peaceful labor demonstration, escalated into violence and was a key turning point in the labor movement in the US. The Progressive Era, early 20th century, brought significant labor reforms, including minimum wage laws, workers' compensation, and child labor laws. Labor movements in the rest of the world. In countries like Japan, India, and Latin America, labor movements began to emerge in response to industrialization and colonial exploitation. In Japan, the labor movement grew during the late 19th century as workers in the textile and mining industries fought for better wages and working conditions. Latin American countries, many of which were transitioning from colonial economies to industrial ones, saw the rise of labor unions and socialist movements that would advocate for worker rights and land reforms throughout the 20th century. The legacy of the Industrial Revolution's labor movements. The labor movements that arose during the Industrial Revolution were crucial in shaping the modern workplace and workers' rights worldwide. They highlighted the need for fair wages, safer working conditions, and the protection of workers from exploitation. Through strikes, unions, and political activism, the labor movements of the 19th century achieved significant reforms, from shorter workdays to better wages and workplace protections. These movements also laid the foundation for broader social changes that would continue into the 20th century, including the rise of socialist movements, the expansion of universal suffrage, and the creation of welfare states. The legacy of the labor movements from the 19th century continues to influence labor rights campaigns today, serving as a powerful reminder of the ongoing fight for justice and equality in the workplace. Women's suffrage in New Zealand, 1893. The fight for women's voting rights. Introduction. A landmark achievement in women's rights. In 1893, New Zealand became the first self-governing country in the world to grant women the right to vote, marking a pivotal moment in the global women's suffrage movement. This landmark achievement was the result of years of hard-fought activism, passionate campaigning, and determination by a group of courageous women who believed in equality and justice. The story of women's suffrage in New Zealand not only highlights the progress made for women's rights, but also serves as a powerful symbol of how social change can be achieved through collective action and unwavering resolve. 1. The context. Women's rights in 19th century New Zealand. The role of women in society. In the late 19th century, New Zealand, like many other countries, was largely a patriarchal society. Women were expected to fulfill traditional roles within the home, focusing on child-rearing and domestic duties, while men held the majority of political power and had access to public life. Women in New Zealand were largely excluded from formal political processes and were unable to participate in elections or hold political office. The legal system of the time reinforced these gender roles, with laws that restricted women's autonomy, particularly in relation to property ownership, voting, and representation. The growing demand for women's rights. By the mid-19th century, the idea of gender equality had begun to take root in many parts of the world. Women's suffrage movements were gaining momentum, particularly in countries like Britain and the United States, where women began organizing to demand the right to vote. In New Zealand, women were also starting to question their exclusion from the democratic process and were becoming increasingly involved in social activism. Women's rights advocates in New Zealand began pushing for equal political participation as part of a broader effort to improve education, health, and workplace conditions for women. 2. The early push for suffrage in New Zealand. The role of early suffragists. The women's suffrage movement in New Zealand was built on the hard work and persistence of early suffragists like Kate Sheppard, Mary Te Tai Mangakohia, and Amelia Bloomer. Kate Sheppard would eventually become the face of the suffrage movement in New Zealand. Born in England and raised in New Zealand, Sheppard became a key figure in organizing the suffrage campaign, using her writing skills to mobilize support and bring attention to the cause. Mary Te Tai Mangakohia, a Maori suffragist, was also instrumental in the push for women's voting rights, advocating for Maori women in particular and promoting a vision of political rights that included Indigenous women in New Zealand. The formation of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, one of the key organizations that spearheaded the suffrage movement in New Zealand was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, formed in 1885. The WCTU, which had a strong presence in many countries, initially focused on temperance, or the prohibition of alcohol, as well as women's education and social reform. However, it soon expanded its mission to include women's suffrage, seeing the vote as an essential tool in improving women's lives and families. The WCTU became a major driving force in the campaign, with members across New Zealand gathering signatures, holding rallies, and organizing petitions to demand that women be granted the right to vote. 3. The campaign for suffrage. Mobilizing support. Petitions and the role of the press. In the late 19th century, women in New Zealand began organizing petitions calling for the right to vote. The first major petition was presented to Parliament in 1891, and although it was unsuccessful, it marked a turning point in the campaign. Kate Shepherd, who was deeply involved in organizing and collecting signatures for the petitions, played a pivotal role in gaining support for suffrage through her skillful use of the press. She used the press to spread the suffrage message and increase public awareness about the importance of women's rights. The 1893 petition, which would ultimately lead to the success of the movement, was signed by more than 32,000 people, representing approximately 1/4 of New Zealand's adult female population at the time. The sheer scale of the petition demonstrated the widespread support for suffrage. Building public support and overcoming opposition. The campaign for women's suffrage was not without its opposition. Many men, and even some women, argued that granting women the right to vote would disrupt traditional gender roles and harm society. Despite these objections, the suffragists gained a growing base of public support. Through the efforts of women like Shepherd and other suffrage leaders, New Zealanders began to see that giving women the right to vote was not only a matter of fairness but also a means of ensuring a more just society. Public speeches, letters to newspapers, and organized marches were just a few of the strategies used by suffragists to rally people to their cause. The movement was bolstered by gender-neutral arguments, focusing on how women's votes could help improve social issues like education, child welfare, and public health. 4. The victory. Women's suffrage granted in 1893. The passage of the Suffrage Bill. The suffrage movement in New Zealand reached its climax in 1893, when Parliament finally passed the Women's Franchise Bill, granting New Zealand women the right to vote in general elections. This decision was the culmination of years of campaigning, petitioning, and lobbying by suffragists across the country. Despite the opposition, the efforts of the suffrage movement led to a victory that was seen as a revolutionary step in advancing women's rights in New Zealand and around the world. The role of the New Zealand government. Prime Minister Richard Seddon, who initially opposed suffrage, eventually came to support the movement due to the massive public demand and pressure from suffragists. Seddon's government was also influenced by the growing recognition that New Zealand had become a more progressive society that could serve as a model for the world. When the bill passed, it marked not only a victory for women but also a win for democracy, as it expanded the idea of universal suffrage to include half of the population, something that had not yet been achieved in many other countries. 5. The global impact. Leading the way for other nations. New Zealand as a model for suffrage movements. New Zealand's granting of women's suffrage in 1893 set a precedent for other countries to follow. The success of the suffrage movement in New Zealand encouraged women's rights activists around the world to continue their campaigns for voting rights. In the United States, the women's suffrage movement would continue for another 27 years before the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Similarly, other countries like Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom would later grant women the right to vote, building on New Zealand's pioneering example. The legacy of the 1893 victory. The victory in New Zealand in 1893 was not just a political milestone, but also a cultural shift. It marked the beginning of a broader movement toward gender equality in many areas of society, including education, work, and family life. Women in New Zealand began to take a more active role in politics, leading to the election of the country's first female MP in 1919 and the establishment of political organizations that further advanced women's rights. The fight for women's suffrage in New Zealand became a symbol of how determination, activism, and solidarity can break down societal barriers and bring about lasting social change. A triumph for women's rights. The granting of suffrage to women in New Zealand in 1893 was a monumental achievement in the struggle for women's rights and gender equality. It was a victory for justice, a testament to the perseverance of women like Kate Shepherd and other suffrage leaders, and an example to the world of the power of organized activism. This victory not only gave women a voice in the political process but also inspired other nations to follow suit, making New Zealand a beacon of hope for the global women's suffrage movement. Today, the legacy of New Zealand's suffrage movement continues to inspire those who fight for equality and social change.